Hello, welcome to our next class. Today I'm talking about determining phasal relationships between planets. All right, so this is a very specific technique and it's very important, and you will see why. Really, what it goes into is that, like the lunar cycle, there is a beginning point when two planets come together. So there's the conjunction when two planets meet up together in the same space. But like the lunar cycle represents, when we have a new moon, the new moon is has joined the sun. And so it's a brand new beginning. And then the moon begins to move past the sun and journey through a new cycle. And the balsamic moon, or the dark moon, the dark moon phase, or the end of the lunar cycle, is when the moon has now come around and completes its journey. And before it returns back to the sun, it's in that very last stage before the returning. And this is what's called the balsamic phase. So we're going to get deeper into this in this class. But what you can understand just in that example is that the significance between what it means to have the conjunction. Is it a new start, beginning conjunction, or is it the end of an entire cycle conjunction? And so you can understand there how different they are, right? So when two planets come together, representing two aspects of our own consciousness, come together and they begin a brand new cycle, then it's going to take on the essence of that dynamic, that energetic dynamic. A new stage, a new phase, like a new moon, is instinctual, like Aries, the first sign. It's the beginning, it's impulsive. It's not yet fully realized or known. But the end of a cycle, when a planet returns back or finalizes that entire cycle by coming to the end of it before it's going to start again, that is an older, more experienced, more wisdom energy that's going on. It's a completion, it's a culmination, and there's a lot of ways to understand this. And it's profound, and I speak a lot of it when I talk about the lunar cycle, and it's definitely part of my passion and why I go so deeply into the lunar cycle, because this cyclical process that the actual moon represents and travels through each month, the planets themselves also replicate the same journey that the moon does each month. So the planets themselves, each and every one of them, has a beginning point, has square points, have opposition points, have the returning, waxing, waning square point, and then the return, or the end, or the culmination of a stage. And so when we start to follow the bigger cycles of the planets, this is how you want to understand it. And understanding the lunar cycle is one of the easiest ways to grasp the bigger cycles, because the lunar cycle is just a more concise understanding of what is actually happening with the bigger cycles. It's the same thing. So we're going to get deeper into this. And so what Jeffrey Wolf Green brought forth is the phasal relationship between Pluto and Mars, and then the phasal relationship between Mars and Venus. And then we can use this phasal relationship model with all planets. So I'm going to give examples as we go forward in this class. And so why why look at the phasal relationship between Mars and Pluto is because Pluto, being the soul orientation in this lifetime, what we are most gravitated to realize and to develop and to resolve and heal. And Pluto being the higher octave of Mars, Mars being the lower octave of Pluto. So Mars is helping Pluto, helping our soul experience by actualizing into consciousness the unconscious desires of our soul. So Mars actively actualizes our desires. And so that's what we mean by the lower octave and higher octave of Pluto, which I've spoken about before, and we'll go much more deeper into as we continue here. But this is why we're using Mars in this way and why it's valuable to consider Mars in this way. Because Mars is going to show the continuation of the process that is underway in Pluto. It's going to show how it's going about it, and by house and sign, whatever aspects it might be into other planets. But when we look at the phasal relationship, is Mars in a conjunction with Pluto? Is Mars in a square? Is Mars in an opposition? Is it a beginning conjunction or square? Is it a waning? Is it an ending square or conjunction? This is going to show us how far along that intention is in the person. So Jeffery spoke about that in his teachings, he shared that there are 8 primary phases, like the lunar cycle here. So in the lunar cycle, we have the new moon, and this is segmented into 45 degrees. So the waxing crescent is 45 degrees later. Remembering, of course, this is 360 degrees in the zodiac, or 360-degree sphere that all of the planets are moving through, right? So the first 45 degrees is the waxing crescent. Then the next 45, we get to the 90-degree square. Then another 45, then we get to the next 90 degrees, which is the 180 opposition to the starting point. Then another 45 degrees is the waning gibbous, then the last quarter square, then another 45 degrees. And so Jeffery spoke about that there are basically 8 primary lifetimes. So, this is a complex idea to consider. He spoke about that if a person has Mars in any one of the 8 primary phases in relationship to Pluto. So let's say we always take the slower moving planet. So I'm going to go back to the other side in a minute and speak about that. But let's say Pluto is here. If Mars is here, or Mars is here, or Mars is here, so one of these, the primary 8 phasal relationships, which we know that the lunar cycle represents this, every 45 degrees is one of the primary phases. And the most potency we know are the squares, the oppositions, and the conjunctions, where there is such significant power going on in those angles. So he spoke about that each one of these, if someone has their Mars in one of these aspects, that's a primary lifetime for the person, meaning that lifetime becomes even more, we don't want to say important by any means, but there becomes an intensity around the realization. And what he also meant by this is that when the angles don't show up in that way, when Mars is not in that relationship, meaning that it would not be a primary lifetime where the soul is orienting towards the realization of that, that it would be less intense. So again, this is something to consider as far as it being a part of the teachings. Now, in my work, I have found it certainly these primary phases here, the squares, the oppositions, and the conjunctions are very powerful experiences to observe in a person. So we'll return back to that. I want to explain how this works. So I've written here, you always start at the slower moving planet and then move counterclockwise. So we know that we move counterclockwise. This is how the planets are moving through the zodiac. So when determining any planet relationship to another, you always start with the slower moving planet. So for instance, Pluto, we'll start at Pluto. And again, this is Oprah Winfrey's chart. So we're going to determine the phasal relationship between Mars and Pluto. So we're going to move and find Mars counterclockwise, and Mars is here. It's Leo at 24 degrees is Pluto. Scorpio, Mars at 23 degrees is here. So that is, we can see an exact 90-degree first quarter square between Mars and Pluto. So when we consider that, we know that this person, anytime a planet is connected to Pluto, there is an intensity of power that is magnified in that archetype, in the psyche. And so when we consider that Mars is this, is a partner with Pluto to help actualize and realize the core soul purpose that that soul has come in oriented towards. To see Mars in such a potent place, we can understand that there's an intensity of that force of evolution that Pluto represents. And we know that Mars carries its own intensity as well, right? So Mars being the lower octave of Pluto, we can see in this archetype of Mars, it's fueled, it's passionate, it's got a lot of energy, it's explosive, it's dynamic. It's about taking full force action, ambition, aggression, initiation, leadership, independence, freedom. So these are the things. Mars is that principle that represents the need to actualize, the need to actively experience and to get and to realize. So there's that masculine nature of independence, of freedom, of individuation. And so we can see how Mars is this this component of Mars being this partner, this quality that is furthering the goal. It's like a, gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like this, Mars is this, it is like the warrior for Pluto. It is the warrior of our soul that fights for us, that fights for the thing, that goes for it, that conquers, that challenges the fears, that harnesses the what it takes, the courage, etc. And so this gets conditioned in different ways when we look at what sign is Mars in is sort of that way. If Mars is in a more passive, softer sign, then that is the orientation of how it's going to function, how it's going to sort of get it done. And then, of course, the house is the area of life. So we see with Oprah that there is an intensity going on. She has come to this juncture in her own soul intention where it's now at the square. There is an internal magnified tension at the square that she must confront herself and the ways by which she has been operating in relationship to this core soul intention. So we want to understand what this means when we're looking at the phasal relationship is that at some point, her soul gravitated to this intention, this orientation of Pluto in the 8th house in Leo, that she was going to, that she needed to, that she desired to really meet with her own power and external power, that she needed to realize her own self-mastery, that she needed to deeply look at herself and in relation to everything, to have a really refined look at life, the Scorpio way, to see what's really going on, to see the truth, to get to the bottom line, to get to the heart of the matter. So she oriented, her soul came to that place in her own growth, and that began. And then she started that journey and went through various lifetimes of that orientation until arriving in this lifetime at a serious junction point of a square to how she is experiencing her own power up against the powerlessness of what's going on with others, and what is she going to do about it. So that is what we can see. And it's in the 11th house, so we know it has something to do with her connection with the collective, with her individuation, with her uniqueness, the need to move ever further away from something, it having to do with relationships and codependency, 8th house, and in the experience of shared resources. That's always what 8th house is. When we have things, others have things, we need to connect and combine. And what happens in that scenario when that happens. So that's the Scorpio 8th house dynamic. And we can see that's been a huge experience for her. You know, with as wealthy as she's become, what has she done with her money? She's shared on various levels in all kinds of ways. And so we can observe that that lesson, in such a magnified, potent way, she felt it around what she's doing with her power and shared resources with the collective, and taking very active steps in that reality. So that is what we're doing here with the relationship between Mars and Pluto. So each one is going to mean a different thing. Of course, understanding the transits will go deeper in as we move through this whole course. But you can see how it really makes a difference when you have this information and when you use it. It's just another deeper layer that we can grasp, because when we don't consider, if we're not considering the relationship between Mars and Pluto, we're just having them sort of in their own independent, it's very inconclusive of what's actually going on for the person. And so that's what we're deepening into the understanding about how significant it is. And the more you work with this, the more you see that these are definitely subtler energetics that we're talking about, but they're also quite profound when we observe them in a person, of actually how impactful it is when we see the Mars. If the Mars is in a new phase, if the Mars is in a balsamic phase, you can really start to grasp that, oh, this soul orientation, if it's in a new phase conjunction, this is new. It's impulsive, it's instinctual for the person. It's not quite fully realized or conscious yet. And so you can understand that that's what's going on for the person. Or if it's in a balsamic phase, it's already quite realized and coming to a close, and understanding that though we cannot know how long, how many lifetimes, we can understand that if it's a balsamic closing phase, that the person has been working through this dynamic for lifetimes, many lifetimes. And so there's so much realized. And when it's a new phase, we can understand that there are yet things unrealized. And so that's what is so significant about this technique to understand. So again, we start with the slower moving planet to understand how far along is the evolutionary relationship between archetypes. So that's what we're determining. New phase being most recent, seed consciousness planted. And then as we journey further in opposition, we know that it's getting much deeper into the realization and so on. What is the evolutionary juncture all about? So of course, again, we want to understand, what does a square mean? What does an opposition mean? What does the conjunction mean? And so forth. Are there any other planets involved? So again, we want to understand what other planets involved. Right here, we see that Oprah has oppositions with Pluto. Pluto's at 24 and the Venus is at 8. So they are wider oppositions. Mercury's at 19. That's closer still. So we could say Pluto is in opposition to Mercury, and her Sun and Venus are not so far away. So we want to take that into consideration. We have what is the juncture about? This is an opposition. And so oppositions are always a confrontation on a societal realization. It's this extreme opposition of self and others. You want to consider an opposition as, when we look at the natural zodiac, we begin at Aries, and the opposition is Libra. And so what does that represent? Self, others. So the new moon is always representing, a new phase. The new moon is an internalized, deeply subjective experience. And the full moon is this illumination of light. It moves people, it moves the masses. The full moon brings towards us, to us, externalized social experiences around what that internalized new moon, planting a seed out of unconscious depths, created. So the new moon, the new phase, creates it. It's the new phase, that the conjunction new phase, which is different than the conjunction balsamic phase. So we're going to get into that in just a minute. So the last I've written here is, what is the conversation about? So we begin to understand the conversation. And so what I mean by that, Pluto, Mars square Pluto. We know that there's a square. There is an internal tension. A crisis in action is the first quarter square. The last quarter square is the crisis in consciousness. So crisis in action, it's the midpoint between the start of the seed at the conjunction and the peak at the full opposition phase. So this midpoint conjunction, this midpoint juncture, which is the first quarter square. So what is this conversation about? There is a need for a pivot, for a shift in direction and orientation around the way that she has been taking action or not taking action. So that's what a first quarter square means. And then we want to give it more depth and specific meaning for this particular person by going deeper into what the house and sign, and if there are any aspects. So for her, we can see that Mars is also square the Mercury and the opposition. So Mercury is involved in this conversation, and Venus and the Sun are also a little further out. So this conversation has to do with her really feeling that her personal self, Mars, that she needs to take action in a different way to get out of whatever may have been holding her back in the sense of her power and powerlessness, realizing that. And we know that she was born into trauma in her family, Uranus, Cancer, South Node. And so she woke up to this extreme reality of powerlessness and abuse. And, or I mean, woke up as in literally came in, realized that that's what was going on at some point. And we can see that she had an intensity of, I need to change. I need to individuate. I need to break free. I need to take actions in such a way as to resolve where I'm at currently in my relationship, where I now find myself in this current lifetime in relationship to eighth house, in the relationship to other people, the codependency, the how people are relating to me, the abuse of her childhood, and she felt that she had much more to offer and that she was made for much more. And she felt that deep inside her. And that Mars informed her of that, we could say in some way. She has this Mars in Scorpio, so she already had this basically repeating the signature of Scorpio, the depths of her soul in the Scorpio, that she is deeply oriented towards paying attention to the details on a psychological, emotional way around what is really going on. And so she comes with Mars in Scorpio, reiterating that same way of being. I'm paying attention, I'm looking deep at what's going on, and a need to empower. Scorpio, in its shadow, it will overpower and possess and control others. But in its highest expression, Scorpio wants to empower others into their power. That's empowering for them and that's empowering for others. That's essentially what Scorpio is about. It's like coming out of Libra into Scorpio. Scorpio realizes that all of that it has power. And oh, wow, others have power too. And what happens when we join power? So this is the Scorpio stage. And so she had that. She was born with that. And Mars in 11th house, she was tapped into her uniqueness. I'm different. I'm unique. I need to represent and be that. And how that is assisting the Mars being like the assistant to Pluto, is it furthering and assisting that journey. So that's part of the conversation. And then when we bring in that there is other planets involved, like Mercury, well, Mercury has to do with communication. So, for her, it's this power and this individuation, and the trauma has to do with communication. So for her, it went down the path of, I need to communicate. And in Mercury, I actually need to revolutionize in that way, in communication. I need to be someone who's going to communicate. And I remember like Phil Donahue, I believe, was the first person who started the talk show host reality back in the day. And then Oprah came in strong from there and really took it to such a huge level. And so her knowing that's already within her, that she needed to communicate in an Aquarian way, in a very objective way. Like she was going to objectively look at the bigger picture of the most intimate and personal details of people's life. She was going to bring an objective lens with an audience. And so we can see how this Mercury aspect of her assisted in this core evolutionary journey of her finding her own personal power while empowering others. And as we know, the Chiron on the North Node, so it was always going to be about healing for her. So what I want to show you here is just a deeper understanding of how to understand the phasal relationships. So when a planet comes in the conjunction with another, so we can either have a new phase conjunction or we can have a balsamic conjunction, which is the closing of a cycle. So we'll have the planet here, let's say Pluto is here, and then any planet that's in conjunction with Pluto, it's either going to be in the beginning position or it's going to be on the closing position. It's going to be closing in towards Pluto or it's going to be moving away from Pluto. So they are so different in their essence, and that's what's very important to understand. So when you see any two planets in conjunction, you want to be aware of, are they in a new phase or is it in the closing phase conjunction? Because understanding, the easiest way I think to understand it is in alignment with the natural zodiac. So the new phase is like Aries. The closing phase is like Pisces, the last sign of the zodiac and the first sign of the zodiac. So the first sign of the zodiac can represent the new moon, the birth, the new stage. We come in, and Aries is unconscious, it's instinctual, it's spontaneous, right? It's not yet formed. So that's what a new moon is about. That's what a new phase is about. It's not yet formed. It's instinctual. It's yet unknown, right? The seed has been planted. And of course, how we sort of work with life and our own consciousness is we can be aware and consciously plant a seed if we actually work intentionally with cycles and with the lunar cycle. So we can consciously plant seeds at the new moon. But if we're not doing that, essentially what is the energetic of what is happening is it's a dark stage, right? It's an unconscious new stage, a cycle of new beginning. So that represents the unconscious realms. Seeds are being planted. We may not even fully know yet what's coming. We may not even fully yet know what's been planted around the new moon time. So I'm just differentiating between, of course, there are times when we are conscious, we're intentional, and we're planting intentional seeds. And then there is the reality also that the nature of life is that the nature of cyclical processes, that things get seeded, and the new phase is always going to represent from out of the depths of unconscious. So it implies this, that we are not yet aware. So the seed is planted. We actually don't know if the seed is ever going to come into form, right? That's also part of the waiting process. So seeds are planted in the darkness, in the unconscious, and then they grow. And then they come forth, and then they become. So the new moon stage or the new phase relationship stage with any planet is that. It's that Aries, new, unconscious. So that's how you want to understand it when you identify it in a chart, which is different than the balsamic phase, which is the journey having already gone through its full course. So when we're talking about the lunar cycle, it's 1 month. But let's consider the Saturn return, for instance. The Saturn return represents that wherever you're born, Saturn is at a certain degree and sign in the zodiac, and it takes 29.5 years for Saturn to orbit the sun and return back to the exact position that it was when you were born. And that's the Saturn return that everybody goes through around 29 years old. And so that returning now, that balsamic stage, is the end of a completion of an entire evolutionary cycle of development. So we can see how the balsamic conjunction contains the wisdom of the seed having come through its growth, its development, and basically it's representing our own consciousness going through an evolutionary cycle of development and now coming to a completion of that stage. And as Jeffrey was talking about, we go through many, many lifetimes, or it takes many, many lifetimes for us, for our consciousness, for our awareness to cycle through stages of growth on any particular sort of area or topic of life. So we can be working on relationship issues, the same sort of relationship issue, depending on where we have our Pluto through lifetimes, many, many lifetimes. And so you can see how we go through stages. It's a new phase, it's a new beginning, it's a new idea, it's a new orientation. And then we gradually increase our awareness around it through lifetime. When we get to the quarter phases, like I mentioned with Oprah, the first quarter, it's this juncture where we really need to make a decision. We need to change direction at the first quarter. It's about the crisis in action because this is the waxing, building, creating phase. It's about the action that's being taken. In the last quarter, when it's the waning, it's the yin returning back inwards, getting ready for the end of the cycle. The last quarter is a crisis in consciousness. So it's not about action as much. It's not about adjustment in the steps we're making, the actions we're taking. It's about the adjustment in the crisis in consciousness represents the need to shift in the way that our awareness and our perspective is oriented towards the particular thing. So that's the last quarter square. Now, the full moon or the oppositions, anytime we see an opposition, if we have Pluto opposite the moon, Pluto opposite Mars, these are going to, this is a major juncture in consciousness. It's a major, the full moons always represent the social reflection. Who are we in reflection to how others are perceiving us, how we're relating externally in the world. So it is a very important phasal relationship in the chart between any planet. So anytime if there's Jupiter opposite Venus or whatever it is, you just want to consider that this is a very much about myself and them, myself and society. So there's different sort of mechanisms that go on in each one of the aspects that you'll learn about, where, for instance, the opposition is, it can be fluctuating between being incredibly social, that social understanding, that social development is just extremely on in that person's lifetime. And so in that overexposure into the social development, what can happen is that the person can then retreat. So it could be periods of extreme externalized exposure to society, and then the fluctuating need to retreat back into self. And so that can be observable. It can also be communicated in the sense that what we're doing as astrologers are basically counseling astrologers. So when you can understand that, you can empathize and sympathize with the person that they are going to actually need times of retreat, that it's actually natural, because sometimes we can feel somewhat confused or conflicted around needing external experience and then needing time alone. But the conflict that people can feel, guilt or whatever it is that we can go through of I'm not spending enough time socially, and we just want to understand that there's necessity, there's reasons why, and we want to be able to communicate this to people. And when we see an opposition, you can understand that that's a mode that's going to show up for the person, that need to the need to come in and return to themselves and come in from all of the social engagement as a way to integrate the process of what they're going through. So with this, I have two other examples. But with this teaching, and I recommend the Jeffrey Wolf Green's two Pluto books, Pluto Volume 1, Pluto Volume 2. And in Pluto Volume 2, he goes much deeper into the phasal relationships between Pluto and Mars and the phasal relationships between Mars and Venus. And so taking it a step further from the explanation of why it's important and why we look at the phasal relationship between Mars and Pluto, next is looking at the phasal relationship between Mars and Venus. And how they are different is that, like I said, Mars is directly representing that principle, that active principle of actualizing into consciousness our desires, our unconscious sort of soul intention and soul desires, so that in an experiential way, that's what Mars is doing. And so the relationship, looking at the relationship between Mars and Venus, shows us the evolutionary journey of how we're in relationship to ourselves and others in regard to the core soul intention of Pluto. So there's a lot of meaning in all of this. And again, this is much more complex. And it takes time to really understand the whole procedure behind this. But I hope you can see how valuable it is. So here's two examples that I'd like to show. Now, going back to Oprah for a moment, we can see that she's in a first quarter square relationship with Mars and Pluto, as we talked about, and she's coming into a Venus opposite Pluto. So also, we see here Mars, if we take the relation, if we want to look at the relationship between Mars and Venus, the slower moving planet is Mars. So we start at Mars, we go counterclockwise again, and we see Venus is in a square by sign, right? It's in the squaring sign, but it's not yet at the 23 degrees, which it would be the square. So we can just note that Venus is coming eventually, maybe next lifetime, into that square to Mars. And so this is the relationship she's having with herself, how the relationship with herself in regard to how she's actualizing this Pluto orientation and her relationship with others. So it's coming into a square. So we can understand that there's some building tension, because when we consider what's happening here is that the new seed conjunction, it's going to be an unrealized intention at the beginning. It's going to gradually increase into consciousness, into awareness as it goes. So at the 45, the waxing crescent, when we look up after a new moon, when there's no sign, it's just darkness. And then we begin to see a crescent, we begin to see the light, awareness begins to dawn. Results are happening. If we're talking about this, the waxing, building phase from out of a new phase, seed planted. So consciousness is coming more and more aware around the core soul intention, the seed planted. By the time we get to the first quarter phase, we are fully aware of this soul intention. And now in that awareness, we need to adjust. We need to adjust our actions. We need to make adjustments in going forward in this direction, because we know that we'll eventually get to the full moon phase where the light will illuminate, where this full phase will illuminate a sort of peak around all that has come through from that seed intention planted? How did it go? What did it look like? What actions created the result of that full opposition phase or the full moon phase? And so the first quarter phase is, we are aware now of this seed orientation that was planted. There is full awareness, and we need to take actions to adjust. And so from the first quarter phase into the full moon phase, it is a time, it's very yang, the creative building, waxing stage. This now, from the first quarter phase to the full moon phase, it's about working at the adjustments, working at how to reorient for basically the best sort of outcome when we get to that socialized state. Now, also keep in mind that, like the natural zodiac, Aries through Pisces, the new phase conjunction of any two planets, or if we're just considering the relationship between Mars and Pluto, the new phase, we are building in our awareness from Aries to Pisces. Let's take the natural zodiac as the example. So in that building, it's about self, right? So it's the self experience, the realization of self. So when we get to the first quarter, it's the realization of, what am I doing with this core intention? It is mostly about the self and our own actions. When we get to the full moon, it becomes a reflective place. How am I, how are me and my intentions and my actions affecting people, affecting externally outside of me? So that full phase, we can see the evolutionary journey that the natural zodiac represents. When we get to that full phase, or that Libra phase, it's now a confrontation with others, us and how we are versus others, and the adjustments that need to be made there, the confrontations that need to be made, so that we can continue this journey of socialization. So from the new beginning, which Aries represents, development of self, development of self and others into socialized experience. So the full moon is going to represent that. And as we continue on from the full moon, that full reflective place and confrontation with external and others, that's from that stage, we go on to, it's a very reflective space on how we are now socialized, the social development. How are we in relationship to the world, to the external experience, to others? And so by the time we get to the third quarter stage, the last quarter square, it's about that confrontation, that readjustment, that pivot in the way that we are being, is in how our perspective has now evolved from the beginning, when the seed orientation was so self-oriented, and then it went through the process of development from out of self into others, into the socialized experience. So the last quarter phase with any two planets is going to be an intensity of the juncture from moving out of the development of self into others, into society, into collective, into now the last stage is the returning back, which is essentially from out of self and other, from out of society, from out of the collective. What's next is the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is source, is God, is reunion back into oneness. So this last stage, where any planet is returning back into the balsamic, into the conclusion of an entire cycle, is considered, it's that spiritualizing phase, in the same way that Aquarius represents that return back into the self individuation, but in relationship to the collective. So how well are we being in our own individualized self within the community, within the collective. That's Aquarius. And then in Pisces, it's a complete merging into the unity of oneness, of source, of creation. So Pisces is representing that return to source, that return to spirit, that return to union with something bigger and greater than the self. And so the all balsamic stages, any planet in phasal relationship that is, less than 90 degrees, closing cycle, 60 degrees, 30 degrees, the closer it gets, you can understand that that person in their consciousness is orienting in a way that is more big picture. If we see the oppositions going on, we know it's a very socialized. It's very much about the collective society that they're in. If it's in a new phase, we know it's very personalized. So I'm going to give some examples of this. So in this chart, we have Pluto, and taking Pluto as the starting point, when we go all the way around, we find Mars in a total balsamic phase to Pluto with Mercury. We also find Venus in a balsamic phase to Pluto. It's less, they're all less than 10 degrees away, closing into Pluto in the balsamic conjunction. So you can see that if we had Mars here on this side of Pluto, we'd have Mars at a new phase conjunction with Pluto. But in this chart, we have Mars in a closing conjunction to Pluto. So what we can make of this information is that the soul has been working on this core soul intention of Pluto in the fourth house, Libra, for many, many lifetimes. And in this lifetime, particularly, this soul is coming to an end. Now, what's very significant about the balsamic phase is that it represents the culmination of an entire cycle. And it's going, part of the mechanism of what functions for a person in the balsamic phase is that anything that hasn't yet been realized, resolved, or healed is going to come up in a very strong way for that person, so that the last of sort of, it's never the last, it's never final or the end. We know that, but it's coming to a, this person has realized so much, and yet there's still more. And so this person will have very powerful soul confrontations to realize in this life. And it's representing that they feel that it's old. There's a wisdom that is in the person around these very issues, around relationships, around the emotional body, around family dynamics. There's very, very old situations, old patterns going on that the person can feel is at a end, is at a closure. And there's just some final lessons that are very significant to be realized in this life around that. And that as they're in a finalizing phase, they'll confront and they'll repeat those very patterns until they are realized and resolved. And in the balsamic ending phase, it's always getting ready for a new phase to begin. It's like right around the corner. So as they're ending these bigger patterns that they have been trying to resolve for many, many lifetimes, new seeds are beginning to be planted. New ways, new patterns are beginning to happen, which will be represented by the next lifetime, where it's a new beginning. It is the new beginning. But prior to getting to that is the closing, the ending stage, where the new seeds begin to show up, right? So that's like when we look at a lunar cycle, when we're at the end, when we're in the dark moon days, and we can look back over the whole month and understand what came through, what was confronted, what was realized, and we know what we've went through. We are in a state of wisdom, a state of having experienced the month-long cycle, whatever came through the various rites of passages that happened to us during that lunar cycle. And then we can know that what we can reflect upon what we have completed and know that there's a new journey ahead in the new cycle that's coming. And we can begin to plant those seeds, or we can not know yet what's coming, but that essence of the new is still there. So this person is very much going to have a lifetime around that. They're also very much going to be deeply rooted in that last stage, that orientation of self, the self orientation, the other orientation, the social orientation, now having moved to the very end stage, which is the Piscean stage of reorientating into a bigger picture. And so for many, this is going to represent someone who's, their consciousness is oriented in that spiritual way, in a seeking to connect in a way where they're connecting with the bigger picture, trying to connect themselves with the bigger picture. So this is the Mars relationship to Pluto. Now, when we consider, we take Mars to see the relationship with Venus. Mars is a slower moving planet. We go again counterclockwise, and Venus is balsamic to Mars. So then what that is telling us is the relationship that this person is having with themselves is also coming to a close. So that's something interesting to understand about the consciousness of a person, that they can also feel in themselves that they have been through this for a long time. They've learned a lot about this area of life. So it can also represent someone who has a lot of wisdom in the arena that we see the balsamic phases going on. Now we want to keep in mind that, there is a spiral that we're talking about. So a new phase is not going to mean that the person potentially has never, ever experienced it, right? It could just be the next stage, right? Because if we think about that this person has Mars in the balsamic phase, there's a lot of wisdom through a lot of lifetime gained in this area. And if they begin again with the Mars at the new phase, it doesn't mean that they'd never experienced this at all, right? If we're considering that idea of the spiral, it's going to imply the next level. So we want to keep that in mind too. So the relationship between Mars and Venus is, if someone is in a very new, Mars is in a new phase relationship with Venus, we want to consider that they're experimenting with new ways of being in relationship to themselves. Like we saw Oprah Winfrey had the new phase, the square coming, but with her Venus to Mars. So we can understand that there is somewhat new essence going on in her consciousness. Again, there's a lot of complexity, and it's important that we want to understand the fundamental concepts governing all of these ideas. And then when we apply them to a chart, that's where it really gets, that's where we can really begin to understand on a personal basis each person. So that's what's important. Always with chart interpretation, it is always about the synthesis of different archetypes. So that's important. And so with this example, I wanted to show you, we do have, if we look at Pluto, the phasal relationship with Mars, it's a little bit less than 60 degrees away. So it's in a last quarter sextile, a little bit less. So it's beyond the square, right? Mars would have been in a square over here at 90 degrees. So this person is not in a major confrontational tension that needs to be resolved in this life that is not happening. They have moved beyond that. We could surmise at some most recent past lifetime, they have confronted major degrees of tension in their own awareness around this core soul intention, around their own power and powerlessness, codependency with others, sharing resources, etc. So they have come through that already, and they are now in that stage that we were just speaking of, which is coming closer and closer to the absolute balsamic stage. So they are now waning into the spiritualized consciousness in regard to this core soul intention. They've come through the seed self orientation, the relationship to others, the relationship with society, and now moving into a more how to relate to themselves in a bigger picture in regard to this. So we can see that. And this person also has the balsamic. Mars is here, and we see that Venus is an exact balsamic to Mars. So again, we can see that this person's relationship to themselves, they are finalizing some major qualities of how they've been relating to themselves. So they're up against some major confrontations. Like I said, sort of the last bastion of patterns that they have not been able to resolve or heal or release or let go of. Because the balsamic also is the end. It is the release. It is the letting go. So it does imply that we are here needing to really face these patterns, let it go, because, well, we're ready. We've achieved, we've accomplished, we've arrived to the end. And so just what's sort of up there to be released. And you can then, when you really know a person in the chart you're looking at, when you see this, you can sort of see, like, yes, that person is right on the cusp of, you know, stepping into something else and letting go of this thing. And I want to mention too that what I have observed through 20 years of reading people's charts, that it's the most common that most people, we spend the first half of our life very much in our past patterns. And so it's, for most people, it is around midlife in the 40s that people really start to, it has taken that much time to realize the patterns, to face the patterns, to acknowledge them, and to have what it takes to sort of move beyond it and resolve it. And so that's something I've observed, just the time it takes people to, and so we can understand that it takes lifetimes, and it takes time to realize, and to become aware of things. And so with this person, I wanted to show that we have Saturn in a first new phase conjunction. So if Saturn was over here on the other side of Pluto, that would be a balsamic conjunction. It would be a totally different interpretation and understanding. So this is important. But we see with this person, Saturn is in a new phase. So when we start to try to determine what does that mean, so Pluto conjunct any planet is going to intensify that lesson, that archetype in the person's psyche, really amplify it. And it's pronounced. So we know that this person was not only born with the soul intention of the 8th house Libra, really realizing relationships and how they're in relationships, the power that they have, the power of others, powerlessness up against powerful limitations, limitations in others, limitations in themselves, and the need to really grow and evolve on a deep relationship level. That's the juncture that Scorpio brings us to. So on top of that, we now bring in this archetype of Saturn. So Saturn is a socialized experience. It has to do with how we are orienting into society, what kind of leadership position we're capable of taking, levels of provision, of structure, of support, of family dynamics. So then we can understand that this person has now begun a new journey in their own awareness and consciousness around these things, around their position in society, around their relationship with their family, around their position in their family, their position of power or not, their position in society or not, their positions around leadership. But this is essential to their soul evolution in this lifetime. If someone had the moon on Pluto, it would be all about the emotional body and the mother and feelings. If someone has Venus on Pluto, it would bring in the deepening around relationships and love. If someone had Jupiter on Pluto, it would bring in energies around our faith, our beliefs, our truth and knowing. And so we get to see what specific this person is also facing and working with, so we can understand. When we understand it as the new phase, then we know that that is rather new. So some of the complexity we can take into consideration with this chart is we know that they're in a balsamic phase in relationship to themselves, that there is wisdom in their relationship to themselves, as far as they have been going through it for so long in themselves, and they understand that they have reached a point in their own self-awareness where they can see bigger patterns that are needing to let go of, and they're working towards letting them go. And then when we take that next layer and bring in the Saturn within this culmination of experience and wisdom of the relationship they've been having with themselves, they're now birthing this new seed orientation around, now that I have gone through a lot of personal self-reflection to the place of I've arrived to an orientation where I do see the bigger picture. I am connected to the bigger picture of myself and the cosmos, of source, of God, of my spiritual connection in this life in some way, right? We see that they're in that journey with self, also with the balsamic to Venus and Mars, but also the Mars starting to close into Pluto here. They're coming to this grander place of wisdom and awareness of the bigger picture. That is their orientation. So now when we layer the Saturn in a new phase, we have Saturn now bringing that into their personal authority, their personal responsibility, Saturn, how they orient within society and their role as a leader, their role in the family. And this is for this person, it's in a new phase. So it shows that they're doing it, they're attempting to establish. And again, it doesn't mean that they've never attempted, right? Because the spiral, but they're attempting to reorient themselves in the realm of personal authority and leadership and a role in society, Saturn and their position in their family, in a new way, in consciousness. And they know that they're doing this, but it's not yet fully realized the how to. So that's what we always want to keep in mind with the new phase conjunction. This is very new. It's very raw. It's very Aries. It's very instinctual. And that's what they're working on. So that's what the lessons will be, confrontations around personal authority, leadership, societal reflection, Saturn, in a way that the person is frankly needing to experience themselves in it to realize what they need to realize. So it's the new phase. And it's an intense stage. We know that any type of conjunction is intense. There's an intense magnified experience for this soul with Saturn, with all of these Saturnian issues. And it's part of their soul purpose. Anytime a planet is with Saturn, like this person over here, part of the soul purpose and soul orientation, the evolutionary growth for them in this lifetime and many lifetimes prior, has been for this person over here, has been the Mercury, Mars, Venus. So partnership, relationship, how they've been able to actualize Mars, their selves, how they've been able to initiate and bring forth their reality. Mercury, communication, information. There's a lot of potency and power around these things for these people. And for this person, it's directly their sole purpose and sole intention is directly linked to Saturn, the family unit, the leadership, and the power in life in this way. So as you can see, there is a lot to be garnered from this technique. And of course, it is quite complex. It takes time. And that's what we're here for, to practice and experience this. And we will have many more chart examples. You can bring your own charts to the space. If you want to post your charts, post your questions in the chat boxes, please do, and we can use the examples to just go deeper into the understanding of the different phases. I will say that the understanding transits and phasal relationships is one of the most complex. It does take some time to really understand. So I do recommend reading what you can in the Pluto books about the different phases so you can have that fundamental understanding. And then as we go deeper into chart examples, of course, it all begins to make sense and, come together. So thank you for joining me. I will see you soon. And let's stay connected with your questions and shares. And we'll keep the learning going. Aloha. Take care.